The first sign of autumn in Prosperity Gulch was not a chill in the air or the turning of the leaves, for the high plains offered little of either. It was the quality of the light, a low, golden slant that made the dust motes dance like tiny spirits in the afternoon sun and painted long, skeletal shadows from the town's lean buildings. While others saw this light as a final, warm caress before the inevitable cold, Agnes saw it as a clock. The ticking was growing louder. Every day, she worked with a quiet, relentless rhythm that bordered on obsession. Her hands, though slender, were tough as old leather, stained with the earth from her sprawling garden. Other women kept tidy little plots of flowers or kitchen herbs. Agnes's land was a fortress of sustenance. Rows of hardened corn stood like soldiers, their husks rattling in the dry breeze. Squash and pumpkins, with skins as thick as shields, cured on her small porch. Inside, the cabin was a constant hum of activity. The air was thick with the scent of drying herbs, simmering fruit preserves, and the sharp tang of vinegar. To the townsfolk, she was an object of pity and quiet mockery. The solitary widow, touched by grief, channeling her sorrow into a frantic, unnecessary harvest. They saw her hauling buckets of water, turning compost, and digging late into the twilight, and they shook their heads. Mayor Thornton, a man whose belly was a testament to the town's supposed prosperity, often watched her from the porch of his large home on the opposite hill. "Look at her," he'd say to his wife, his voice a low rumble of amusement. "Still trying to feed an army of ghosts. A sad thing, what loneliness does to a person's mind." His wife would nod, her gaze sympathetic but distant. They didn't understand the memory that fueled Agnes's labor. It wasn't loneliness that drove her, it was the chillingly clear voice of her grandmother, a phantom whisper from a childhood spent in a harder, less forgiving land. "The earth remembers," the old woman used to say, her knuckles white as she kneaded dough. "It remembers famine, and it remembers fools who think the fat times will last forever." Agnes remembered. And so, she worked. The most peculiar part of her labor was invisible to prying eyes. Late at night, when the town was a scattering of dim lights and the coyotes sang their lonely hymns to the moon, Agnes was not sleeping. She was digging. With a small spade and a bucket, she was excavating the earth beneath her cabin's floorboards, one painstaking load at a time. The scent of damp, cool soil filled her small home, a primal perfume of secrets and survival. She had pried up the floorboards in the center of her single room, a space hidden beneath a thick, patched rug. The work was brutally slow. The ground was packed hard, stubborn as a mule, but her persistence was harder. Each night, she would lower herself into the growing cavity, the candlelight casting a flickering, monstrous shadow of her on the walls. She'd dig until her shoulders ached and her breath came in ragged gasps, then haul the buckets of dirt out to her garden, scattering the evidence of her secret toil under the cover of darkness. This hidden labor was a ritual, a prayer made of sweat and soil. It was here, in the cool, dark earth, that she felt closest to the wisdom that had been passed down to her. Her grandmother had never lived in a house with wooden floors. Her home was a soddy, carved from the prairie itself, with a root cellar that was the heart of their existence. "Never trust what you can see," her grandmother had warned, her eyes narrowed as she pointed to the pantry shelves, respectably full but vulnerable. Pantry shelves are for neighbors and taxmen. The real food, the food that keeps your soul in your body when the world turns to ice, that goes in the dark. That goes in the earth. Agnes could still feel the chill of that cellar, the damp smell of potatoes and turnips, the sense of profound security it offered. It was a promise whispered from the ground itself, "You will endure." Now, in Prosperity Gulch, a town that named itself for its confidence, that promise felt more urgent than ever. The town's general store was well stocked, its shelves groaning under the weight of goods brought in by regular supply trains. Mayor Thornton spoke of their full-grain silo as if it were a monument to his own foresight. "We are a beacon of stability," he declared at every opportunity. "No citizen of this town will ever know true want." Agnes heard the words, but she also heard the echo of her grandmother's laughter, a dry, knowing sound. "Pride is the thinnest blanket against a long winter," the old woman would have scoffed. And so, as the town slept soundly in the cradle of its own assurance, Agnes continued to dig, creating her own promise, her own quiet rebellion against the foolish optimism of men. The hole was now a small room, shored up with scavenged planks of wood, a hidden womb beneath the world, waiting to be filled. She was not just storing food, she was storing a memory, a truth the town had long forgotten. The town hall meeting was a stuffy affair, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and self-satisfaction. Mayor Thornton stood at the front, his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. He was in his element, holding court, reassuring his flock that their faith in him, and in the town's manifest destiny, was well placed. "I look around this room, and I see the faces of prosperity," he boomed, his voice echoing off the rough-hewn timbers. "I see hard workers, good families, and a community built on the solid rock of common sense and preparation." A smattering of applause followed. He let it die down, a practiced smirk playing on his lips. "Our town silo is full to bursting. The shelves of Mr. Henderson's general store are stocked. We have faced every season with strength, and this one will be no different." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled townsfolk before it settled, deliberately, on the small, still figure of Agnes, who stood near the back. "Of course," he continued, a note of condescending humor creeping into his tone, "there are always those among us who let fear get the better of them. Those who mistake frantic squirreling for true preparedness." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. They all knew who he meant. The widow. The strange woman who worked her garden like a field hand and never seemed to smile. They hoard and they worry, seeing a blizzard in every cloud. They prepare for a famine that will never come, while the rest of us live our lives in good faith and fellowship. Now the laughter was louder, more open. A man named Peterson, who owned a small freight business, called out, "Maybe she's expecting a second flood, Mayor." The room erupted. Agnes did not flinch. Her expression remained unchanged, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the mayor's shoulder, as if she were looking at something he couldn't see. Her stillness was more powerful than any retort. It was a silence that unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. He felt a prickle of irritation. Why wouldn't she react? Why wouldn't she give him the satisfaction of seeing her shame or anger? He pushed onward, raising his voice to recapture the room's attention. "My point is this: community is our greatest storehouse. Trust in your neighbors, trust in your leadership, and trust in the proven prosperity of this town. We will face the winter as we always have, together, and with confidence." More applause, this time thunderous. The meeting concluded with backslapping and optimistic chatter. As the crowd dispersed, Agnes slipped out unnoticed, melting back into the twilight. She didn't hear the parting shots, the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. Poor woman lost her senses when her husband passed. "All that food will just rot in her cellar." But it wasn't a cellar. It was something far more secret. And it wouldn't rot. The sheer volume of it was staggering, a testament to a season of unwavering, backbreaking labor. £600. The number itself felt solid, a bulwark against the unknown. Agnes moved with the quiet efficiency of a quartermaster stocking a fortress. The process was methodical, each item placed with care, its position in the hidden compartment chosen for longevity and accessibility. First came the staples, the foundation of survival. Heavy canvas sacks of flour, ground from her own corn and wheat, were lowered carefully into the driest corner, stacked upon flat stones to keep them from the damp earth. Beside them went the legumes, 50-pound sacks of pinto beans, split peas, and lentils, their contents rustling like dry whispers of the meals they would one day become. Next was the preserved bounty of her garden. Dozens of cloth-wrapped bundles of dried corn, the kernels like hard, golden jewels. Tightly sealed earthenware crocks filled with pickled cabbage and beets, their sharp, earthy scents contained for now. And strings of dried apples and peaches, leathery and sweet, hung from the wooden beams she had installed, a fragrant canopy of summer saved from the clutches of winter. The proteins were the most precious. Smoked and salted hams, wrapped in layers of cheesecloth, were suspended from hooks. Crates of salt fish, packed tight, filled another section. And countless small jars contained rendered lard, each one a vessel of warmth and energy, a promise of light in the coming darkness. Finally, she filled the remaining space with the hardiest of the root vegetables. Potatoes, carrots, and turnips, their skins still dusted with the soil they were born from, were packed carefully into wooden crates filled with sand, a trick her grandmother had taught her to keep them firm and fresh for months. As she worked, a strange peace settled over her. This was not the frantic activity the town saw. This was a slow, deliberate act of love for a life she was determined to protect, for the memory of the wisdom that guided her. Every sack she lowered, every jar she placed, was a defiance of the easy optimism that surrounded her. It was an acknowledgement of a harsher reality, a truth that the plains knew in their very bones: nature was indifferent, and fortune was fickle. The final item was a small, cloth-wrapped parcel containing a handful of seeds for the next spring. A promise not just of survival, but of renewal. She stood for a moment in the cool, dark space, breathing in the commingled scents of earth and food, of preservation and life. It was done. She replaced the floorboards, carefully sweeping dirt into the seams to hide her work. She laid the heavy rug back over the spot, its worn patterns a map of a secret world. That very night, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were delicate, almost hesitant, melting as they touched the ground. In town, lights burned bright. Laughter and music spilled from the saloon. Children pressed their faces to the panes of their windows, their eyes wide with delight. It was the first snow, a beautiful, magical thing. A sign of the cozy season to come. But as Agnes stood at her own small window, watching the flakes drift down in the lamplight, she felt no joy. She felt only a profound, somber sense of readiness. The clock had stopped ticking. The door had just been locked. The snow was a liar. It came first as a gentle promise, a soft white blanket tucking the world in for a long winter's nap. For 3 days, it was beautiful. The town of Prosperity Gulch looked like a holiday postcard. The children built snowmen, their laughter muffled and pure in the still air. The adults remarked on the beauty of it, how clean and bright it made everything look. They had seen snows like this before. It would last a week, maybe 2, and then the supply trains would resume their schedule, their whistles a familiar, reassuring sound. But on the 4th day, the character of the storm changed. The gentle flakes turned small and hard, driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a venomous howl. The sky, which had been a soft grey, darkened to the colour of a bruise. This was no longer a picturesque snowfall, it was an assault. The wind stripped the warmth from the cabins, finding every crack and seam. It sculpted the snow into monstrous drifts that swallowed fences and piled up against doors, sealing people inside their homes. The world outside the window ceased to exist, replaced by a churning, blinding vortex of white. Days bled into one another, marked only by the meager light that filtered through the storm. The town, once so connected, became an archipelago of isolated, shivering households. The initial novelty curdled into a grim routine. Men spent hours each day just trying to keep their doorways clear, a losing battle against the relentless accumulation. The snow was a living thing, a hungry beast that seemed determined to bury them all. Inside, families huddled around their stoves, feeding them precious wood, watching their stockpiles dwindle with alarming speed. The mood shifted from cozy contentment to a low-grade, gnawing anxiety. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store, put a sign on his door, rationing in effect. It sent a ripple of unease through the few who could see it. The town's confidence, once as solid and unshakable as the plains themselves, was beginning to erode. In his large house on the hill, Mayor Thornton maintained a facade of calm, but his wife saw the worry etched around his eyes. "It's just a squall," he insisted, more to himself than to her. "It'll blow over." "It always does, but this storm felt different." It had a personality, a malevolent persistence he had never encountered before. The silence was the worst part. The wind would occasionally die down, and in those moments, a profound, unnatural stillness would descend. There were no birds, no distant cattle, no rumble of the train on the far-off tracks. There was only the immense, crushing weight of the snow. It was a silence that spoke of isolation, of being utterly and completely cut off from the rest of the world. Through it all, Agnes's cabin stood like a small, stubborn stone in a raging river. The drifts piled high against her walls, insulating her further. Inside, it was warm. The scent of a slow-simmering stew filled the single room. She moved with the same calm deliberation as always, her routine unchanged. She ate her simple, nourishing meals. She mended her clothes. She read by the light of her lantern. She listened to the storm, not with fear but with a kind of solemn respect. It was exactly as her grandmother had described it. The long winter had arrived. The town central storehouse, once Mayor Thornton's proudest symbol of civic foresight, was now a place of grim calculations and dwindling hope. The cold had been its first enemy. A section of the roof, burdened by an impossible weight of snow, had developed a leak. Water had dripped down, freezing, thawing, and refreezing, ruining a dozen sacks of flour and turning a crate of potatoes into a foul-smelling, solid block of ice. What remained was disappearing with terrifying speed. The initial rationing had been generous, a precaution. Now, it was a necessity born of desperation. Mr. Henderson, his face gaunt and perpetually worried, doled out fractions of what families needed. A cup of flour. A handful of beans. The process was fraught with tension. Neighbors who had shared drinks at the saloon now eyed each other with suspicion, watching to see if one received a single bin more than another. The veneer of community was cracking under the strain of empty bellies. "This is an outrage," a man named Blackwood shouted at the mayor during one such distribution, his voice thin but sharp with anger. "You told us we were prepared. You told us there was enough." Thornton, his own fine coat now looking too big for his shrinking frame, could only offer hollow reassurances. "We must all make sacrifices," he blustered, his voice lacking its usual confident boom. "This is a temporary measure. The storm will break, and the trains will come. We must simply hold on." But fewer and fewer people believed him. His promises felt as empty as their pantries. The confident leader who had mocked the town's worriest was now just another hungry, frightened man, one who wore his authority like an ill-fitting costume. He had no answers. His power had been built on the illusion of plenty, and now that the illusion was gone, he was exposed. He would retreat to his cold, large house, the mockery he'd aimed at Agnes now a bitter poison in his own mind. He remembered her silent, steady work, the way she moved with a purpose that seemed to come from a place of deep, unshakable knowledge. He had called it fear. Now, huddled by his own meager fire, he wondered if it had been wisdom. While the town starved slowly, Agnes lived by a different clock. Her life was governed by the careful stewardship of her hidden bounty. Each meal was planned, each ingredient used to its fullest potential. Potato peels were saved for broth. Every last morsel of salted meat was savored. She was not feasting, but she was nourished. The warmth in her cabin came not just from her well-fed stove, but from the profound security that radiated up through the floorboards. She could hear the storm's rage, but it felt distant, irrelevant. The true battle, the one for survival, had been fought and won months ago, in the soil of her garden and the darkness beneath her feet. She felt no triumph, only a deep, abiding sorrow for the people of the town. Their suffering was a product not of the snow, but of their own blindness. They had put their faith in boasts and buildings, while the real truth lay silent and waiting in the earth all along. The hunger began as a dull ache, a constant, unwelcome companion. Then it sharpened, becoming a clawing, desperate thing that gnawed at the spirit as much as the stomach. The town of Prosperity Gulch was being hollowed out from the inside. Faces grew thin and sallow, eyes sunken and haunted. The smallest tasks became monumental efforts. A profound lethargy settled over the community, broken only by fits of weak, irritable anger. Children, once boisterous and full of life, became listless and quiet, their whimpers a constant, heart-breaking soundtrack in the cold cabins. The doctor, a good man named Finch, was helpless. His small stock of medicines was useless against starvation. He could offer only boiled water and grim sympathy. When young Mary Peterson, the freight owner's daughter, fell sick with a fever her body was too weak to fight, a new and terrible level of fear gripped the town. Her parents watched her fade, their hearts breaking with the knowledge that a single hearty meal might give her the strength she needed, a meal they could not provide. The last of the public stores were distributed, a pitifully small ration of cornmeal for each family. After that, there was nothing. The silo was empty. The storehouse was bare. The illusion of prosperity had been utterly consumed. A small, ragged group of townsfolk gathered outside Mayor Thornton's house. There was no shouting, no anger left. They were too weak for that. They just stood there in the crushing snow, a silent, skeletal accusation. Thornton appeared at his door, a man utterly defeated. The bluster and arrogance were gone, replaced by a raw, undisguised despair. "There is nothing left," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper that was swallowed by the wind. "I have nothing. We have nothing." He looked at their gaunt faces, at the hopeless voids of their eyes. And in that moment of absolute failure, the memory of Agnes surfaced again, no longer as an object of mockery, but as a sliver of an impossible, irrational hope. He remembered her garden, her ceaseless work, her quiet defiance. He had called her a fool for preparing for a famine that would never come. Now the famine was here, and he was the fool. A desperate thought, a wild gamble, took root in his exhausted mind. What if her frantic squirreling, as he'd so smugly called it, had actually amounted to something? A few extra jars of preserves? A forgotten sack of potatoes? At this point, even a handful of dried beans felt like a miracle. He looked at Blackwood and Peterson, their faces masks of misery. "There is one last place," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The widow, a flicker of disbelief crossed their faces, then was extinguished by the sheer force of their desperation. They had mocked her. They had laughed at her. And now they were going to her door to beg. There was no lower place for them to fall. The walk to Agnes's cabin was a pilgrimage of shame. Mayor Thornton, Peterson, and Blackwood trudged through the deep snow, their movement slow and labored. The short distance felt like miles. With every step, Thornton felt the weight of his own arrogance. His jokes, his condescending pronouncements, his public ridicule of this woman, it all came back to him, each memory a fresh sting of humiliation. They were not leaders marching to find a solution, they were beggars crawling toward their last, most unlikely hope. They reached her small home, a dark shape against the endless white, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a sign of life that felt both miraculous and accusatory. For a long moment, no one moved. The shame was a physical barrier, holding them back. Finally, Peterson, his face a mess of grief and desperation for his sick daughter, stumbled forward and knocked weakly on the door. The sound was small, pathetic against the vast, silent landscape. The silence from within stretched on, and a cold dread began to settle in Thornton's gut. What if she was gone? What if she had succumbed, alone, weeks ago? What if they had come all this way only to find another empty home, another monument to their failure? Then, the latch clicked. The door swung inward. Agnes stood before them. And the first thing that hit them was the smell. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was the scent of baking bread. It was the smell of life, of sustenance, of a world they thought had vanished forever. The aroma was so powerful, so impossible, that for a moment, they thought they were hallucinating, their hunger-addled minds conjuring fantasies. They stared at her, this woman they had dismissed as a mad recluse. She was not gaunt. Her eyes were clear. She looked strong. "Agnes," Thornton began, his voice cracking. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. "We are the town, there is no food left." Peterson pushed past him, his face pleading. "My daughter," he choked out. "She's sick. Please. Anything you have. A crust of bread. A potato." Agnes looked at their faces, one by one. She saw the collapsed pride in Thornton, the raw agony in Peterson, the hollowed-out despair in Blackwood. These were the men who had led the laughter against her. She held their gaze, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken history of their scorn and her quiet endurance. They were completely at her mercy. She could have shut the door in their faces, and no one could have blamed her. Instead, after a moment that felt like an eternity, she gave a single, slow nod. She turned, walked to the center of the room, and knelt. With a grunt of effort, she pulled back the heavy rug. Then, she reached down and lifted a single, wide floorboard. The men leaned forward, peering into the darkness, expecting a small crawl space, a few hidden jars. What they saw stole the breath from their lungs. In the flickering lantern light, they saw not a small cache, but a cavern of plenty. Sacks of flour and beans stacked high. Hams hanging from the rafters. Crocks and crates arranged in neat, unbelievable rows. It was a treasure hoard, a secret kingdom of food hidden beneath the floor of the poorest woman in town. It was impossible. It was a miracle. They stared, speechless, their minds unable to process the scale of what they were seeing. It wasn't just food. It was salvation. There was no "I told you so," there was no lecture, no moment of triumphant gloating. Agnes's victory was as quiet and deliberate as her preparation had been. She did not relish their shame, she simply set it aside as an obstacle to the real work that needed to be done. Her authority was immediate and absolute, not because she demanded it, but because it was earned. She was the only one in the room who knew what to do. "Peterson," she said, her voice calm and steady, breaking the stunned silence. "Your daughter needs broth. Take this salted ham and these carrots. Boil them down. Make sure she drinks as much of it as she can." She handed him the items, and the big, broken man wept, clutching the food to his chest like a priceless treasure. She then turned to the mayor. "Thornton. Blackwood. You will organize the men. We will bring everything up from the cellar and take it to the town hall. It will be our distribution point. Everyone gets an equal share, starting with the families with children." Her instructions were clear, practical, and left no room for argument. The two men, who days before had been the pillars of the town's social order, nodded like chastened schoolboys. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The news spread through the starving town like a wildfire. At first, it was met with disbelief, a rumor too good to be true, a mass hallucination born of hunger. But then came the proof. Thornton and Blackwood, looking humbled and grimly determined, led teams of weakened men to Agnes's cabin. They worked in shifts, hauling the heavy sacks and crates through the snow. The sight of the food, real, solid, life-sustaining food, brought the entire town to its knees. People wept openly in the streets, touching the flour sacks as if they were holy relics. In the town hall, the space where Thornton had once mocked her, Agnes now presided over the fair and orderly distribution of her stores. She was a general commanding a vital supply line. She knew exactly how much each family needed, how to stretch the resources, how to make every last bin and grain of corn count. She established a community kitchen, where the strongest women cooked great vats of stew, ensuring that everyone received a hot meal each day. The arrogance and suspicion that had poisoned the community vanished, replaced by a quiet, desperate cooperation. The same people who had whispered about her behind their hands now looked at her with a reverence bordering on awe. They followed her instructions without question. Mayor Thornton, stripped of all pretense, became her most diligent lieutenant, hauling crates and portioning out rations with the focused humility of a penitent. He was no longer a mayor, he was just a man, saved from his own folly by the very person he had scorned. Agnes had not just saved their bodies, she was saving their community, rebuilding it from the ground up on a new foundation of shared vulnerability and her own unshakable, quiet strength. The thaw came as slowly and deliberately as the winter had been relentless. It began not with a sudden warming, but with a subtle change in the light, a softening of the air. The iron grip of the cold loosened its hold. Water began to drip from the eaves, a steady, rhythmic percussion that sounded like the heartbeat of a returning world. The colossal snowdrifts, which had seemed like permanent new features of the landscape, began to shrink, revealing the familiar shapes of fences and porches beneath. The town of Prosperity Gulch emerged from its white tomb, blinking in the pale spring sun. They were all thinner, etched with the memory of hardship, but they were alive. Every last one of them. Agnes's hidden cellar was now just an empty space beneath her floorboards, smelling of damp earth and the ghosts of plenty. The last of the flour had been baked into bread, the last of the beans simmered into stew. Her 600 pounds of foresight had been measured out, portioned, and consumed, transformed into another season of life for the people who had once mocked it. The town was irrevocably changed. The name Prosperity Gulch now seemed like a foolish boast from a bygone era, a name chosen by people who understood nothing of true wealth. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a more sober, more respectful silence. When the first supply train finally broke through, its whistle a shrill cry across the thawing plains, there was no wild celebration. There was only a quiet, collective sigh of relief. The people did not forget. They couldn't. The memory of the hunger was seared into them, but so was the memory of their salvation. Agnes was no longer the widow, the eccentric recluse on the edge of town. She was simply Agnes, a name now spoken with a quiet reverence. She sought no position, no formal title, but her authority was undisputed. When it came time to plan for the next winter, the whole town listened. They planted larger gardens. They learned her methods of preserving and drying. They worked together to build a new community storehouse, this one properly insulated and managed with a new, hard-won wisdom. Mayor Thornton, a quieter and more thoughtful man, insisted on a public plaque being placed on its wall. It didn't bear his name, or the names of the town founders. It had a simple inscription, in memory of the long winter, and the wisdom of the earth. Agnes never spoke of the past, never reminded them of their folly. She didn't need to. Her very presence was a reminder. She continued her work, her hands in the soil, her gaze fixed on the horizon, reading the seasons, listening to the whispers of the earth. She had shown them that true prosperity wasn't found in a full silo or a boastful speech. It was found in the quiet, humble, and relentless work of preparation. It was the understanding that survival is a debt that is paid in advance, a lesson the town of Prosperity Gulch would never again forget. And as you sit in your own warm home, with your own full pantry, perhaps you can feel the echo of that truth. What hidden cellars have you prepared in your own life? What wisdom have you stored away for the long winter you hope will never come? Take a moment, think on it, and maybe share your thoughts below. Because every generation thinks it's the one that has finally tamed the wilderness until the snow begins to fall.